Throughout history, certain places have become synonymous with horror, tragedy, and unspeakable evil. These aren't just locations where bad things happened once. These are places where the darkness seems to linger, where the walls themselves seem to remember the suffering that occurred within them. Some of these locations have become tourist attractions, their terrible histories packaged and sanitized for public consumption. Others remain abandoned, too haunted by their past for anyone to want to reclaim them. Today, we're exploring 10 locations where something truly terrifying happened. These aren't ghost stories or urban legends. These are real places where real atrocities occurred, where lives were destroyed, and where the echoes of suffering still resonate. Some of these stories involve individual acts of madness and violence. Others involve systematic cruelty on a massive scale. But all of them remind us that the most terrifying monsters are often human, and that the capacity for evil exists in places we'd never expect. These locations span the globe and span centuries. Some are well known, their stories told and retold until they've become part of our collective consciousness. Others are lesser known, their horrors hidden or forgotten until investigators brought them to light. But all of them share one thing in common. They're places where something went terribly, horrifically wrong. Let's begin our countdown with number 10. Number 10. The Villisca Axe Murder House, Iowa. On the night of June 9, 1912, in the small town of Villisca, Iowa, 8 people were brutally murdered in their sleep. The victims were Josiah Moore, his wife Sarah, their 4 children, and 2 young girls who were staying overnight as guests. All 8 were killed with an axe, their skulls crushed as they slept. The killer moved methodically through the house, murdering each victim in their beds, then covering the mirrors and windows with clothing to block out light. The crime scene was discovered the next morning when neighbors noticed that the Moore family hadn't emerged from their house and their chores remained undone. When they entered the home, they found a scene of unimaginable carnage. Blood covered the walls and ceilings. The murder weapon, an axe belonging to Josiah Moore, was found in the guest bedroom, leaning against the wall. The investigation that followed was bungled from the start. Curious townspeople were allowed to walk through the crime scene, contaminating evidence. The local police had no experience with a crime of this magnitude. Various suspects were investigated, including a traveling preacher named George Kelly, who had attended church services with the Moore family the night before the murders. Kelly was tried twice for the crimes, but both trials ended in acquittal due to lack of evidence. The murders were never solved. Over a century later, we still don't know who killed the Moore family and their young guests, or why. The brutality of the crime, the fact that it occurred while the victims slept peacefully in their beds, and the killer's strange behavior of covering the mirrors all contribute to the horror of this case. But here's what makes the Villisca Axe Murder House particularly terrifying. The house still stands. It's been preserved almost exactly as it was on that terrible night in 1912. The same wallpaper covers the walls. The same layout remains, and if you visit, you can see the rooms where 8 people were murdered in their sleep. The house has become a tourist attraction, offering daytime tours and overnight stays for those brave enough. Many visitors and paranormal investigators have reported strange experiences in the house. Unexplained sounds, feelings of being watched, objects moving on their own, and apparitions of children. Some people have reported feeling physically ill or experiencing panic attacks while inside the house. Skeptics argue that these experiences are the result of suggestion and the power of knowing what happened in the house. When you're standing in a bedroom where children were murdered with an axe, your mind naturally creates fear and anxiety. But believers insist that something dark remains in the Villisca house, that the violence of that night left a permanent mark on the location. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the randomness and brutality of it. This wasn't a targeted killing motivated by revenge or financial gain. This was a family annihilated in their sleep for reasons we may never understand. The killer entered their home in the dead of night and methodically murdered 8 people, including 4 children aged 5 to 12. And then, they simply disappeared, never to be identified or caught. The Villisca Axe Murder House stands as a monument to unsolved horror, a place where innocence was destroyed and justice was never served. It's a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying things happen in the most ordinary places, and that evil can strike without warning or explanation. Number 9. Unit 7, 31, Manchuria. In the 1930s and 40s, in the Japanese-occupied region of Manchuria in northeastern China, one of the most horrific programs of human experimentation in history was conducted. Unit 731, officially known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, was a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit that conducted lethal experiments on living human subjects. The unit was commanded by General Shiro Ishii, a microbiologist who convinced the Japanese military that biological weapons could be a decisive factor in warfare. The facility, located near the city of Harbin, was enormous, covering 6 square kilometers and employing over 3,000 scientists and staff. But its true purpose was hidden behind bureaucratic names and official secrecy. The experiments conducted at Unit 731 were beyond comprehension in their cruelty. Prisoners, referred to by staff as logs to dehumanize them, were infected with diseases including plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhoid. They were then vivisected, dissected while still alive and without anesthesia, so researchers could observe the effects of the diseases on living organs. The victims were mostly Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, but also included Russians, Koreans, and other nationalities. But the horrors didn't stop at disease research. Prisoners were subjected to frostbite experiments, where their limbs were frozen and then thawed to study the effects. Some were placed in pressure chambers until their eyes popped out. Others were deprived of food and water to study starvation and dehydration. Pregnant women were infected with diseases to study the effects on fetuses. Prisoners were burned with flamethrowers, exposed to lethal doses of radiation, and injected with animal blood to study transfusion reactions. The experiments were conducted with scientific precision, but without any regard for human suffering. Researchers took detailed notes and photographs, documenting every stage of their victims' deterioration and death. It's estimated that between 3,000 and 10,000 people died in Unit 731's experiments, though the true number may be higher. What makes Unit 731 particularly terrifying is what happened after the war. When Japan surrendered in 1945, General Ishii ordered the facility destroyed and all evidence eliminated. The remaining prisoners were killed, the buildings were blown up, and the staff scattered. But here's the truly horrifying part. The researchers were never prosecuted for war crimes. The United States, eager to obtain the biological warfare data that Unit 731 had gathered, granted immunity to the researchers in exchange for their data. General Ishii and his staff were never tried at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. They returned to civilian life in Japan, many becoming respected doctors, professors, and businessmen. The victims and their families never received justice or even acknowledgement of what had been done. The site of Unit 731 in Harbin has been partially preserved as a museum. Visitors can see the ruins of the facility, including the furnaces where bodies were cremated and the cells where prisoners were held. The museum displays some of the equipment used in the experiments and documents the atrocities that occurred there. But walking through the ruins, knowing what happened there, is a profoundly disturbing experience. This wasn't a moment of madness or a crime of passion. This was systematic, scientific torture and murder conducted over years by educated professionals who saw their victims as nothing more than experimental subjects. It's a reminder that evil can be bureaucratized, that atrocities can be committed in the name of science and national interest, and that justice is not always served. Number 8. The Hinterkaifeck Farmstead, Germany. On the evening of March 31, 1922, 6 people were brutally murdered at a remote farmstead called Hinterkaifeck in Bavaria, Germany. The victims were the farmer Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, Victoria's 2 children, and the family's new maid, who had arrived at the farm only hours before the murders. All 6 were killed with a mattock, a farming tool similar to a pickaxe. But what makes the Hinterkaifeck murders particularly terrifying isn't just the brutality of the crime. It's what happened before the murders and what the evidence suggests about the killer's behavior afterward. In the days leading up to the murders, Andreas Gruber reported strange occurrences around the farm. He found footprints in the snow leading from the forest to the farm, but no footprints leading back. He heard footsteps in the attic and found a newspaper on the property that no one in the family had purchased. The family's previous maid had quit 6 months earlier, claiming the farm was haunted. She reported hearing strange noises and feeling an unsettling presence. On the night of the murders, Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and Victoria's daughter Cecilia were lured to the barn one by one where they were killed. The killer then went to the house and murdered Victoria's son and the new maid in their beds. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. After the murders, the killer appears to have stayed at the farm for several days. Evidence suggests that someone fed the animals, ate food from the kitchen, and even lit fires in the house. Neighbors reported seeing smoke from the chimney in the days after the murders. When the bodies were finally discovered on April 4th, 4 days after the killings, the animals had been cared for, and there were signs that someone had been living in the house. Who was this person? Why did they kill the Gruber family? And why did they stay at the farm afterward, calmly going about daily chores while 6 bodies lay in the barn and house? The investigation that followed examined over 100 suspects, but never identified the killer. Theories ranged from a robbery gone wrong, to a revenge killing, to a crime of passion involving Victoria, who was rumored to have had an inappropriate relationship with her father. Some suspected Victoria's husband, who had been declared dead in World War I but whose body was never found. Could he have returned and killed the family in a rage? The Hinterkaifeck farmstead no longer exists. It was demolished in 1923, a year after the murders, and the land was absorbed into neighboring properties. But the mystery remains unsolved, and the case continues to fascinate criminologists and true crime enthusiasts. What makes Hinterkaifeck so terrifying is the premeditation and the cold-blooded nature of the crime. The killer appears to have been hiding on the property for days before the murders, perhaps living in the attic or the forest nearby. They watched the family, learned their routines, and planned their attack. Then, after killing 6 people, including 2 children, they stayed at the farm, living among the bodies, as if nothing had happened. This suggests a level of psychopathy that's difficult to comprehend. The killer wasn't driven by passion or rage. They were methodical, patient, and utterly devoid of empathy. They could murder a family and then calmly feed their animals and eat their food. It's this cold calculation, this complete absence of normal human emotion, that makes Hinterkaifeck one of the most disturbing unsolved crimes in history. Number 7. Jonestown, Guyana. On November 18, 1978, in a remote settlement in the jungles of Guyana, 909 people died in what was initially reported as a mass suicide, but was actually a mass murder. The victims were members of the People's Temple, a religious organization led by Jim Jones, a charismatic but increasingly paranoid and unstable leader. Jonestown, as the settlement was called, was supposed to be a utopia, a socialist paradise where people of all races could live together in harmony, free from the persecution and inequality of American society. Jones had convinced over 1,000 of his followers to leave the United States and join him in building this new community in the Guyanese jungle. But Jonestown was far from paradise. It was a prison camp where Jones exercised total control over his followers. People worked long hours in the fields with little food. Dissent was punished with public humiliation, physical abuse, and forced labor. Jones conducted white nights, practiced suicide drills where members were ordered to drink what they were told was poison, testing their loyalty. Those who tried to leave were hunted down and brought back. The end came when U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan visited Jonestown to investigate reports of abuse. Some members tried to leave with Ryan, and Jones, fearing that his crimes would be exposed, ordered them killed. Ryan and 4 others were murdered at a nearby airstrip as they tried to board their plane. Jones knew that authorities would soon arrive, and he ordered his followers to commit revolutionary suicide. Large vats of grape-flavored Flavor Aid were mixed with cyanide, Valium, and other drugs. Parents were ordered to give the poison to their children first. Those who refused were forced at gunpoint. People who tried to run were shot by armed guards. The scene that greeted investigators the next day was apocalyptic. Bodies were everywhere, many lying face down in neat rows. Parents clutched their children. Families died together. The smell of death was overwhelming. It took days to remove all the bodies, and the images from Jonestown shocked the world. What makes Jonestown particularly terrifying is that it wasn't a sudden explosion of violence. It was the culmination of years of psychological manipulation and abuse. Jones had systematically broken down his followers' ability to think independently, to question authority, or to resist his commands. By the time he ordered them to die, many had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that they complied willingly, believing they were making a revolutionary statement. But many didn't die willingly. Autopsies revealed that some victims had been forcibly injected with poison. Others had been shot. Children, who couldn't possibly understand what was happening, were murdered by their own parents on Jones's orders. This wasn't suicide. It was mass murder orchestrated by a madman who preferred to kill his followers rather than lose control over them. The site of Jonestown has been reclaimed by the jungle. The buildings have collapsed and been overgrown, but the memory of what happened there remains. It's a reminder of the dangers of blind faith, of charismatic leadership without accountability, and of how easily people can be manipulated into committing or accepting atrocities. Jonestown gave us the phrase, "drinking the Kool-Aid," a reference to blindly following a leader even to one's own destruction. But this phrase, often used casually, obscures the true horror of what happened. This wasn't about people making a free choice. This was about people who had been psychologically tortured and manipulated for years, who were murdered when they were no longer useful to their leader's ego. Number 6. The Killing Fields, Cambodia. Between 1975 and 1979, the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, led by Pol Pot, orchestrated one of the 20th century's worst genocides. An estimated 1.7 to 2 million people, nearly a quarter of Cambodia's population, died from execution, starvation, disease, and forced labor. The regime's goal was to create an agrarian communist utopia by eliminating anyone associated with the previous government, intellectuals, professionals, and ethnic minorities. The term killing fields refers to the numerous sites across Cambodia where mass executions took place. The most infamous of these is Choeung Ek, located about 17 kilometers from Phnom Penh, the capital. This site alone contains the remains of nearly 9,000 people, though the true number of victims may be higher. At Choeung Ek and other killing fields, victims were brought in trucks, often at night. They were told they were being relocated to new homes. Instead, they were led to pits and executed. To save bullets, most victims were killed with farming tools, hoes, axes, bamboo sticks, and palm fronds. Many were beaten to death. Others had their throats cut. Children were killed by being swung against trees, their heads smashed against the trunks. The executioners were often young soldiers, some barely teenagers, who had been indoctrinated by the Khmer Rouge to see their victims as enemies of the revolution. They were told that even children had to be killed because they might grow up seeking revenge. The regime's slogan was chilling: "To keep you is no benefit. To destroy you is no loss." What makes the killing fields particularly horrifying is the scale and the systematic nature of the genocide. This wasn't random violence or the chaos of war. This was organized, bureaucratic mass murder. The Khmer Rouge kept detailed records of their victims, photographing them before execution and documenting their crimes, which often consisted of nothing more than wearing glasses, speaking a foreign language, or having soft hands that suggested they weren't farmers. Before being sent to the killing fields, many victims were imprisoned and tortured at facilities like S21, a former high school in Phnom Penh that was converted into a detention and torture center. Prisoners were photographed upon arrival, interrogated under torture until they confessed to fabricated crimes, and then sent to Choeung Ek for execution. Of the approximately 14,000 people imprisoned at S21, only 7 are known to have survived. Today, Choeung Ek is a memorial site. Visitors can walk the grounds where thousands were murdered. The most striking feature is a Buddhist stupa, a tower that houses the skulls and bones of more than 5,000 victims, arranged by age and gender. Walking around the site, you can still see fragments of bone and clothing emerging from the earth, reminders of the atrocity that occurred there. The site is haunting in its ordinariness. It's a peaceful, green area that gives no immediate indication of its terrible history. But as you walk the paths and see the mass graves, the reality becomes overwhelming. This is a place where thousands of innocent people were murdered for no reason other than being perceived as threats to a paranoid regime's ideology. What makes the killing fields even more disturbing is how recent this genocide was. This didn't happen in ancient history, or even in the distant past. This happened in the 1970s, within living memory. Some of the perpetrators are still alive. Some have never faced justice. And the scars of this genocide still affect Cambodian society today. The killing fields remind us that genocide is not a relic of the past. It can happen anywhere, at any time. When ideology becomes more important than human life, when people are dehumanized and labeled as enemies, and when those in power are willing to commit mass murder to achieve their goals. Number 5. Auschwitz-Birkenau, Poland. No list of places where something terrifying happened would be complete without mentioning Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest and most notorious of the Nazi concentration and extermination camps. Between 1940 and 1945, over 1.1 million people were murdered at Auschwitz, the vast majority of them Jews, but also including Poles, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. Auschwitz was not just a place of death. It was an industrial killing facility, designed and operated with bureaucratic efficiency. The camp complex consisted of 3 main parts: Auschwitz-Spars, the original camp; Auschwitz II-Birkenau, the extermination camp; and Auschwitz III Monowitz, a labor camp. Together, they formed a vast system dedicated to the systematic murder of human beings. When prisoners arrived at Birkenau, they underwent selection. SS doctors would quickly assess each person, sending those deemed fit for work to one side, and those deemed unfit, the elderly, the sick, children, and mothers with young children, to the other. Those selected for death were told they were going to shower and disinfect. Instead, they were led into gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, where Zyklon B poison gas was released. Within minutes, everyone inside was dead. The bodies were then removed by Sonderkommandos, prisoners forced to work in the gas chambers and crematoria. These prisoners had to remove gold teeth from the corpses, cut off women's hair to be used in textiles, and burn the bodies in massive ovens. The Sonderkommandos were regularly killed and replaced to eliminate witnesses to the atrocities. But the gas chambers were only one method of killing at Auschwitz. Prisoners were also shot, hanged, beaten to death, worked to death, starved, and subjected to horrific medical experiments by doctors like Joseph Mengele, who performed surgeries without anesthesia, injected chemicals into prisoners' eyes to try to change their color, and conducted experiments on twins that often resulted in death. The conditions for those not immediately killed were barely survivable. Prisoners were crammed into barracks designed for far fewer people, with inadequate sanitation, heating, and food. Disease was rampant. Prisoners were forced to work long hours in brutal conditions. Those who became too weak to work were sent to the gas chambers. What makes Auschwitz particularly terrifying is not just the scale of the killing, though that alone is incomprehensible. It's the systematic, industrial nature of it. The Nazis designed Auschwitz to kill as many people as possible, as efficiently as possible. They kept detailed records. They improved their methods. They treated mass murder as a logistical problem to be solved. Today, Auschwitz-Birkenau is preserved as a museum and memorial. Visitors can walk through the camps, see the barracks where prisoners lived, the gas chambers and crematoria, and the personal belongings of victims. Mountains of shoes, suitcases with names written on them, human hair, prosthetic limbs. The site receives over 2 million visitors per year, making it one of the most visited Holocaust memorial sites in the world. Walking through Auschwitz is a profoundly disturbing experience. The famous gate with the words Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free, a cruel lie told to prisoners. The rows of barracks stretching into the distance. The ruins of the gas chambers, partially destroyed by the Nazis as they tried to hide evidence of their crimes. The memorial at Birkenau, where plaques in multiple languages commemorate the victims. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Auschwitz is what it represents about human nature. This wasn't the work of a few psychopaths. Thousands of people were involved in operating the camp. Guards, administrators, doctors, engineers, and bureaucrats. Most were ordinary people who went home to their families at night after a day of facilitating mass murder. Auschwitz reminds us that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a bureaucrat following orders, a doctor conducting research, or a guard just doing his job. Auschwitz stands as a monument to the Holocaust and a warning about what can happen when hatred, prejudice, and totalitarianism go unchecked. It's a place where the worst of humanity was on full display, where the systematic murder of millions was carried out with industrial efficiency, and it's a reminder that we must never forget what happened there, lest it happen again. Number 4. The Amityville House, New York. On November 13, 1974, in the quiet suburb of Amityville, New York, 23-year-old Ronald DeFeo Jr. murdered his entire family as they slept. Using a .35 caliber rifle, he shot and killed his father, mother, 2 brothers, and 2 sisters. All 6 victims were found lying face down in their beds, and remarkably, despite the loud gunshots, none of the neighbors reported hearing anything unusual that night. DeFeo was arrested the next day and eventually convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder. During his trial, he claimed that voices in the house had commanded him to kill his family. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences and died in prison in 2021. But the story of the Amityville house didn't end with the murders. 13 months later, in December 1975, George and Kathy Lutz moved into the house with Kathy's 3 children from a previous marriage. They knew about the murders, but got the house at a bargain price and decided the past didn't matter. They lasted 28 days. According to the Lutzes, from the moment they moved in, they experienced terrifying paranormal activity. They claimed to see apparitions, including a demonic pig-like creature with glowing red eyes that Kathy's daughter befriended and called Jody. They reported swarms of flies appearing in the middle of winter, green slime oozing from the walls and ceilings, and cold spots throughout the house despite the heating being on. George claimed to wake up at 3:15 a.m. every night, the approximate time that Ronald DeFeo had murdered his family. He became obsessed with the boathouse and would spend hours there, despite the freezing temperatures. Kathy reported levitating off her bed. The children's beds allegedly moved on their own. A priest who came to bless the house claimed he heard a voice tell him to get out, and later developed blisters on his hands. The family fled the house in January 1976, leaving most of their possessions behind. They never returned. Their story became the basis for Jay Anson's book, The Amityville Horror, published in 1977, which became a bestseller and spawned a media franchise including numerous films, documentaries, and books. But here's where the story becomes controversial. Many people, including subsequent owners of the house and investigators, have claimed that the Lutz's story was a hoax. They point out inconsistencies in the family's accounts, the lack of physical evidence, and the fact that no other residents of the house, before or after the Lutzes, have reported any paranormal activity. The most damaging evidence against the Lutz's story came from William Weber, Ronald DeFeo's defense attorney. Weber claimed that he, George Lutz, and Kathy Lutz concocted the haunting story over several bottles of wine as a way to make money and generate publicity. The Lutzes denied this, but the accusation cast doubt on their entire account. So what really happened at the Amityville house? Did the Lutzes experience genuine paranormal activity, or did they fabricate the story for fame and profit? The truth is probably somewhere in between. It's possible that the Lutzes, knowing about the murders and perhaps already predisposed to believe in the paranormal, interpreted ordinary occurrences as supernatural. Old houses make noises. Plumbing can cause strange sounds. Stress and fear can cause people to see things that aren't there. Combined with the knowledge that 6 people were murdered in the house, it's not surprising that the Lutzes might have been on edge and interpreted everything through a paranormal lens. It's also possible that some of their experiences were real, but exaggerated for the book and subsequent media appearances. They may have experienced some strange occurrences, then embellished them to make a better story. Or if you believe in the paranormal, it's possible that the murders left some kind of psychic imprint on the house, that the violence and trauma created an environment where paranormal activity could occur. The fact that the activity allegedly stopped after the Lutzes left could be explained by the idea that they were somehow sensitive to or attracting the phenomena. The Amityville house still stands today at 112 Ocean Avenue, though the address has been changed to discourage curiosity seekers. The distinctive quarter-moon windows that featured prominently in the film adaptations have been replaced with ordinary windows. The house has been sold several times, and subsequent owners have reported no paranormal activity whatsoever. Whether you believe the Lutz's story or not, the Amityville house remains infamous. It's a place where a real family was murdered, and that fact alone makes it a location of genuine horror. The paranormal claims may be disputed, but the 6 people who died there are not. The house stands as a reminder of a terrible crime, and as a symbol of how tragedy can be exploited and sensationalized. Number 3. The LaLaurie Mansion, New Orleans. In the heart of New Orleans' French Quarter stands an elegant mansion at 1140 Royal Street. To passersby, it looks like any other historic building in the area, with its distinctive architecture and wrought iron balconies. But this mansion has a dark history that makes it one of the most notorious addresses in America. The house was built in 1832 and was purchased by Dr. Louis LaLaurie and his wife, Delphine, a wealthy socialite from a prominent New Orleans family. The LaLauries were known for hosting lavish parties and were considered part of the city's elite. But behind the facade of wealth and sophistication, something terrible was happening. On April 10, 1834, a fire broke out in the LaLaurie mansion. When firefighters arrived and began searching the house, they made a horrifying discovery in the attic. They found several enslaved people chained to the walls, showing signs of prolonged torture and abuse. Some had been mutilated. Others had been subjected to crude medical experiments. The conditions were so shocking that even in a time when slavery was legal and enslaved people had few rights, the public was outraged. According to reports from the time, the victims showed evidence of having been tortured for months or even years. Some had broken bones that had healed incorrectly, suggesting repeated abuse. Others had been subjected to what appeared to be surgical procedures without anesthesia. The exact details of what was found are disputed, as many accounts were sensationalized by newspapers of the era, but all agree that the scene was horrific. When word of the discovery spread, an angry mob formed outside the mansion. Delphine LaLaurie and her husband fled, reportedly escaping to France, where they lived out the rest of their lives without ever facing justice for their crimes. The mansion was vandalized by the mob, and the enslaved people who were found were taken to a local jail for medical treatment, though many died from their injuries. The LaLaurie mansion has had a troubled history since that day. It's been a school, an apartment building, a furniture store, and a bar. It's been owned by numerous people, many of whom have reported strange occurrences, unexplained sounds, apparitions, and feelings of unease. Some owners have left after only a short time, unable to shake the feeling that something dark lingers in the building. Actor Nicolas Cage owned the mansion from 2007 to 2009, purchasing it for over $3 million. He never lived there and sold it at a significant loss after facing financial difficulties. The house is currently a private residence and is not open to the public, though it's a popular stop on ghost tours of New Orleans. What makes the LaLaurie mansion particularly terrifying is the contrast between its elegant exterior and the horrors that occurred within. This was a place where the wealthy elite gathered for parties, completely unaware that people were being tortured in the attic above them. Or perhaps they did know, or suspect, but chose to look the other way because the LaLauries were part of their social circle. The case also highlights the broader horrors of slavery. While Delphine LaLaurie's cruelty was extreme, the institution of slavery itself was built on violence and dehumanization. The fact that her crimes shocked even a slave-owning society shows how far beyond acceptable norms her behavior was, but it also reminds us that slavery itself was a system of terror and abuse. The LaLaurie mansion stands as a monument to this dark chapter of American history. It's a reminder that evil can hide behind wealth and respectability, that atrocities can occur in plain sight, and that the most elegant facades can conceal the darkest secrets. Number 2. Pripyat, Ukraine. On April 26, 1986, at 1:23 a.m., reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine exploded during a safety test. The explosion released massive amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere, creating the worst nuclear disaster in history. The nearby city of Pripyat, home to nearly 50,000 people, most of them workers at the plant and their families, was evacuated 36 hours after the explosion. The residents of Pripyat were told to take only essential items and that they would be able to return in a few days. They never came back. The city was abandoned, left exactly as it was on that April day in 1986, and it remains abandoned to this day, a ghost city frozen in time, too contaminated with radiation for people to safely live there. What makes Pripyat particularly terrifying is not just what happened there, but what it looks like now. The city is a time capsule of Soviet life in the 1980s, but nature has begun to reclaim it. Trees grow through buildings, vines cover walls, wild animals roam the streets, and everywhere there are reminders of the lives that were interrupted. Abandoned apartments with belongings still inside, schools with textbooks on desks, an amusement park that was set to open just days after the disaster. The amusement park is particularly haunting. It features a Ferris wheel that never carried passengers, bumper cars that were never driven, and other rides that stand rusting and overgrown. The Ferris wheel has become an iconic symbol of Chernobyl, appearing in countless photographs and videos. It stands as a monument to interrupted joy, to a future that never came. But the most terrifying aspect of Pripyat is invisible. The radiation. The city and the surrounding exclusion zone remain contaminated with radioactive isotopes that will persist for thousands of years. While some areas are now safe enough for brief visits with proper precautions, other areas remain highly dangerous. There are hotspots where radiation levels are still lethal. The human cost of the Chernobyl disaster is still being calculated. 31 people died in the immediate aftermath, most of them firefighters and plant workers who were exposed to lethal doses of radiation. But the long-term effects are much harder to quantify. Thousands of people have developed cancers and other illnesses linked to radiation exposure. The psychological impact on the hundreds of thousands of people who were evacuated and displaced is immeasurable. The disaster also had far-reaching environmental consequences. A large area around Chernobyl, approximately 2,600 square kilometers, was declared an exclusion zone and remains largely uninhabited. The forests in the area absorbed massive amounts of radiation and remain dangerous. Animals in the zone have shown genetic mutations and health problems, though ironically, the absence of humans has allowed wildlife populations to flourish. Today, Pripyat has become a dark tourism destination. Guided tours allow visitors to walk through the abandoned city, to see the empty buildings and overgrown streets, to stand in the shadow of the Ferris wheel and imagine what might have been. Visitors must carry radiation detectors and follow strict safety protocols, and they can only stay for limited periods. Walking through Pripyat is a surreal and disturbing experience. The city looks like the set of a post-apocalyptic movie, but it's real. These are real buildings where real people lived. These are real schools where real children studied. This is a real city that was killed in a single night by an invisible enemy. Pripyat stands as a monument to the dangers of nuclear power when safety is compromised, to the hubris of believing we can fully control such powerful technology, and to the fragility of human civilization. It's a place where time stopped, where a thriving city became a ghost town overnight, and where the consequences of human error will persist for millennia. Number 1. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, instantly killing an estimated 120,000 people and injuring countless others. By the end of 1945, the death toll had reached approximately 210,000, when including those who died from radiation sickness and injuries in the months following the bombings. These remain the only times in history that nuclear weapons have been used in warfare. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima, codenamed Little Boy, exploded at 8:15 a.m. on August 6th. It detonated approximately 600 meters above the city, creating a fireball with temperatures exceeding 1 million degrees Celsius. Everything within a 1-kilometer radius was instantly vaporized. People near the hypocenter were reduced to shadows, burned into walls and pavement, their bodies completely disintegrated. Those who survived the initial blast faced horrors that are difficult to comprehend. The thermal radiation caused severe burns on anyone exposed within several kilometers. The blast wave destroyed buildings and sent debris flying at lethal speeds. Fires broke out across the city, creating a firestorm that consumed everything in its path. And then came the radiation sickness, a slow and agonizing death for many who had survived the initial explosion. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb, codenamed Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. The destruction was similar, though the city's geography limited the blast's spread somewhat. Still, tens of thousands died instantly, and many more died in the following days, weeks, and months. The survivors, known as hibakusha, faced not only physical injuries, but also long-term health effects from radiation exposure. Many developed cancers years or decades after the bombings. Children born to survivors showed higher rates of birth defects and genetic abnormalities. The psychological trauma affected generations. What makes Hiroshima and Nagasaki particularly terrifying as locations is that they represent humanity's capacity for total destruction. These were not military targets in the traditional sense. They were cities filled with civilians, men, women, children, elderly people. The bombs were designed to kill as many people as possible, to cause maximum destruction, to break the will of an entire nation through terror. The debate over whether the atomic bombings were necessary or justified continues to this day. Some argue that they ended the war quickly and saved lives that would have been lost in a prolonged invasion of Japan. Others contend that Japan was already on the verge of surrender, and that the bombings were unnecessary acts of mass murder, or that they were primarily intended as a demonstration of power to the Soviet Union. But regardless of one's position on the morality or necessity of the bombings, the fact remains that these are places where hundreds of thousands of people died in an instant, where entire cities were destroyed, where the power of the atom was unleashed on human populations for the first and, so far, only time. Today, both Hiroshima and Nagasaki have been rebuilt and are thriving cities, but they maintain memorials and museums dedicated to remembering what happened. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial, also known as the Atomic Bomb Dome, is one of the few structures that survived the blast. It's been preserved in its damaged state as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and serves as a powerful reminder of the bombing. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum displays artifacts from the bombing. Watches stopped at 8:15, the exact time of the explosion, clothing worn by victims, burned and tattered, photographs of the destruction and the injured, and personal stories of survivors. The museum is a sobering experience, confronting visitors with the human cost of nuclear warfare. In Nagasaki, the Peace Park and Atomic Bomb Museum serve similar functions, preserving the memory of what happened and advocating for nuclear disarmament. Both cities have become symbols of peace, with their mayors regularly speaking out against nuclear weapons and calling for their elimination. Hiroshima and Nagasaki represent the ultimate terrifying location because they show us what we're capable of. They demonstrate that humans have created weapons that can destroy entire cities in seconds, that can kill hundreds of thousands of people with a single bomb, that can poison the environment for generations. They remind us that we live in a world where such weapons still exist, where the threat of nuclear war remains real, and where the lessons of history must be remembered to prevent such horrors from happening again. These cities stand as monuments to the victims of nuclear warfare and as warnings to future generations. They're places where something truly terrifying happened, where the power of science was turned toward destruction on an unprecedented scale, and where the consequences of that destruction are still felt today. These 10 locations represent some of the darkest chapters in human history. From individual acts of madness to systematic genocide, from scientific atrocities to nuclear devastation, these places remind us of humanity's capacity for evil and the terrible consequences when that capacity is unleashed. What makes these locations particularly disturbing is that they're real. These aren't horror movie sets or fictional locations. These are actual places where actual people suffered and died. You can visit many of them today, walk where victims walked, stand where atrocities occurred, and confront the reality of what humans can do to each other. Some of these places have been preserved as memorials and museums, serving as educational sites that ensure we never forget what happened. Others have been abandoned or destroyed, their histories fading but not forgotten. And a few have been rebuilt and repurposed, with new life growing over old tragedies. But all of them serve a purpose. They remind us that evil is real, that atrocities can happen anywhere, and that we must remain vigilant against the forces that lead to such horrors. They remind us to value human life, to resist dehumanization and hatred, and to speak out against injustice before it escalates into tragedy. These locations also raise difficult questions about memory and commemoration. How do we remember terrible events without glorifying them? How do we honor victims without exploiting their suffering? How do we educate people about atrocities without traumatizing them? And how do we ensure that never again truly means never again? The fact that many of these locations have become tourist destinations is itself controversial. Is it appropriate to visit places where people suffered and died? Does tourism help preserve memory and educate people? Or does it trivialize tragedy and turn suffering into entertainment? These are questions without easy answers, and different people will have different perspectives. What's clear is that these places matter. They're not just historical footnotes or interesting stories. They're evidence of real events that shaped our world and continue to affect us today. They're reminders of the worst of humanity, but also, in some cases, of the best: the courage of survivors, the dedication of those who seek justice, and the determination to ensure that such horrors are never repeated. As we've explored these 10 terrifying locations, we've confronted uncomfortable truths about human nature and history. We've seen that evil can take many forms: the madness of individuals, the cruelty of regimes, the consequences of hatred and prejudice, and the devastating power of modern weapons. We've seen that atrocities can happen in any time period, in any country, under any political system. But we've also seen that memory persists, that justice is sometimes served, and that even in the darkest places, there can be hope for a better future. These locations stand as warnings and as memorials, as places of horror and as places of learning. They remind us of where we've been and challenge us to ensure we never go there again. The most terrifying thing about these locations is not that they exist, but that they could exist again. The conditions that led to these atrocities, hatred, dehumanization, unchecked power, technological advancement without ethical consideration, still exist in our world today. These places remind us that we must remain vigilant, that we must speak out against injustice, and that we must never become complacent about the potential for evil. These are places where something terrifying happened, but they're also places where we can learn, remember, and commit ourselves to building a world where such horrors become truly impossible. That is their ultimate purpose and their most important lesson. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to explore more mysteries that deserve answers, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Every case matters. Every story deserves to be told. Thank you for watching. Until the next mystery.